Hello and welcome to the Here For You podcast. In this podcast, we explore topics of psychology, philosophy, mental health and therapy, as well as the intersections between these disciplines. If you'd like to support the show, please visit the Patreon page. The link for this can be found in the show notes of the podcast. Also stick around to the end of the podcast to hear about more details of workshops, different ways you can support, and upcoming shows as well. Have a good listen. Welcome to the podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the wounded healer. So we'll be exploring a little bit about what a wounded healer is, what it means to be a wounded healer. We'll be exploring the advantages and disadvantages of the wounded healer. And we'll also be exploring what sort of factors might go into somebody becoming a wounded healer. Okay, so starting off with what is a wounded healer. So broadly defined, a wounded healer is somebody in a healing role who has lived experience of mental health distress or trauma. This concept spans across cultures and times. There's many examples within myth, particularly within Greek myth. So there's a figure in Greek myth called Chiron, who was a centaur. He was born, his father was Zeus and his mother was a mortal woman. He was born from Zeus, transforming himself into a horse and raping his mother to give birth to Chiron. So he was born out of trauma. At his birth, his mother was appalled by his physical appearance of being half horse and half man and discarded him. As he grew up, he became a healer on the battlefields of ancient Greek warriors. He would help to treat those wounded within war situations. In the course of his duty within this sphere, he was hit by a poison arrow. And because he was a demigod, he didn't die from the poison arrow. He just remained in constant pain throughout his life without dying. And as a final act of sacrifice, Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods, was condemned by the gods to be chained to a rock and have his liver picked out by ravens the rest of his existence. Chiron, in a final act of sacrifice, chose to take Prometheus's place. And according to Greek mythology, Chiron can still be found within that rock, chained, having his liver repeatedly eaten out for all eternity. So Chiron is this typical archetype of the wounded healer, somebody who was born of trauma and experienced multiple traumatic things, was in pain throughout his life, and used that pain and used that suffering to heal others, to help people in battlefield situations. He was a medic within that context. He also went on to tutor Hercules in Greek mythology. And so this classical archetype of somebody who took their pain and put it into their work, put it into something that was meant to help other people and heal other people. So the concept of the wounded healer, typified by Chiron, is much elaborated on by Carl Jung, who highlighted the basic structure of this archetype. And he highlighted this basic structure as a wound being suffered. So a wounded healer starts from a wound that is being suffered. That wound is somewhat healed. So somebody heals that wound, that suffering, to an extent in which they can function and manage, and that this experience of healing is then used to aid in the healing of other people. So there's something about a wound, the healing of that wound, and then the experience of the healing process being used to help other people to heal from their wounds. Just to situate this within the current context, I think some statistics are really useful here. So there's a very well-known statistics in the UK of 1 in 4. So this 1 in 4 statistic is that 1 in 4 people within the general population have some sort of mental health problem or have some sort of mental health lived experience within any given year. Now, let's contrast that 1 in 4 statistic with a statistic of 96%. And 96% is the prevalence of childhood trauma in graduate psychology students. as found by Cooley in 2019. Also, this contrasts that with 74% as a statistic, which is the number of psychotherapists who cite their own experience of trauma as a significant motivator to their chosen career, found by Barr in 2006, and 67%, which is the percentage of trainee psychologists with lived experience of mental health difficulties, found by Grice et al. In 2018. And this is quite interesting, I think, this idea of a general population of 1 in 4, which would equate to 25%, versus 96%, 74%, 67%, as we just mentioned there. I think this really highlights that actually within the psychology profession, within the therapeutic professions, there's a high percentage and high prevalence of people who have experienced some sort of mental health challenges themselves, have lived experience of this, and may have experienced their own sort of trauma. Of course, we can't take these statistics outright. We need to be conscious as we're sort of analysing this because, of course, there is the idea that people who are working in this field may be more likely to identify what their trauma is and therefore more likely to advocate for it or more likely to acknowledge that they have this experiences. So that may account for some of the some of the disparity in statistics that we're seeing there. However, the number is high enough, I think, for it to be significant in our consideration of the role of trauma and woundedness that comes into people in healing professions. So what's the advantages and disadvantages of being a wounded healer? So some of the disadvantages is that it may lead to heightened vulnerability of clinicians experiencing vicarious trauma. In previous podcasts, we've talked about vicarious trauma. And what we found in that podcast was that people who have had lived experience of mental health challenges or have had trauma themselves may be more prone or more vulnerable to the experience of vicarious trauma. There may be the risk of emotionally absent or dissociated clinicians when working with clients challenging emotional material. This may be that somebody who has lived experience of mental health may have a coping mechanism of dissociating from their own emotions and therefore may not be able to engage with the emotional material of clients themselves. As a contrast to that, there may be people over-identifying with the client's material, so really presenting as if they know exactly what that client feels from the experiences that they've had, because they may have had something that they perceive to be similar. And of course, this can be very problematic. It can take away from the client's experiences of pain and make it focus on the clinician's experience. So we can have two ends of the spectrum there. You can have clinicians who may be dissociated from the client's emotional material and clinicians who are overly involved with that material and making it more about their therapeutic space rather than the client's therapeutic space. And this can happen both with the over-identification as well as it can be through projecting experiences into the client. So if somebody is bringing traumatic material, there may be a projection of, okay, this person's experience has been just like mine, and therefore the way that they heal must be just like how I've healed from this experience. And of course, this can be challenging because, again, it detracts from the person who is bringing their story and bringing their experience. And likewise, this may lead to boundary confusion and possible boundary breaches. So people over-identifying with their clients, they may overstep what the boundaries of the professional relationship are and lead to ultimately harm towards the clients within their care. And of course, what all this may lead to is a space where a therapy is being used for a clinician's therapy rather than for the client's purposes. Some of the advantages, however, is that people who are wounded healers tend to have greater confidence that their clients will recover. And this has been found in multiple research studies. People who have had that lived experience really feel that they can hold on to a lot more hope and confidence that their clients will come to a place of recovery, will come to a place of healing themselves. They often have greater empathy and a deeper understanding of the clients' experiences. They can be more likely to promote a healing narrative over a disorder or diagnosis one to clients. Um, this may be through a verbal narrative as well as a modeling of a healing journey. So somebody who is a wounded healer may be more inclined to promote a narrative understanding of what somebody's suffering is rather than a pure diagnosis one, and be able to maybe go on more of a narrative journey with that person. While we also speak about a disadvantage maybe being a higher risk of vicarious trauma, there's also the potential for a higher prevalence of vicarious post-traumatic growth. So this idea that people can experience vicarious post-traumatic growth with their clients, they can experience the positive aspects of them coming through their healing journey and get to experience some of that along with their clients as well. A, a counselor or a therapist or any healer who is coming to the profession from a wounded place may develop as an individual a lot of meaning and purpose and growth through being a therapist. So their role as a therapist may be very, very meaningful for them, may be very, very purposeful, and it may help them to grow both as a therapist and as an individual within that space, and further help to heal their journey. Of course, this needs to be taken in consideration that therapy is primarily about clients and not about a therapist's growth, but it will likely also aid in a therapist's growth as well. And likewise, people who wounded healers have been found to be able to engage in more patience and higher faith throughout the therapeutic journey. Okay, so we've spoken a little bit about what a wounded healer is. We've looked at some statistics. We've had a brief exploration of what some of the advantages and possible disadvantages of being a wounded healer are, both to the therapists themselves as well as to the clients and populations that they work with. Let's have a little bit of exploration around why people might become wounded healers, what sort of factors in people's life may lead them to becoming wounded healers. So we're going to be exploring a little bit of the why of things. And the most common reason cited in the literature as to why somebody who has been wounded goes on to become a wounded healer or a healer is that it's the individual clinician's need to self-heal. That's often the biggest reason why somebody who has been wounded may engage in a healing relationship or a healing profession with other people is through their own desire and their own need to find some sort of self-healing. And this may come from both a conscious or an unconscious place. So somebody could go into training or go into a healing profession very much with a conscious awareness of, I've had these traumatic experiences and let me try to understand that more and help other people through that understanding. Or it can come through an unconscious place of somebody thinking they're getting into the profession for a different reason and maybe not acknowledging the aspect of their own lived experience within the rationale and reasons for joining a healing profession. So more specifically, the need to heal the wounds created from early childhood, particularly the wounds created from loss, deprivation, and needs not being met from caregivers. So what this point speaks to is that more specifically, it's not just the need to self-heal, but actually the need to self-heal specifically early child wounds and wounds created and psychological challenges created through early childhood relationships, and that being through active abuse, through deprivation, as well as neglect. This was found by Barnett in 2007 that wounded healers in particular tend to want to heal deeper early childhood wounds, and that's more specifically what attracts people to the healing professions from being wounded themselves. And although motivation towards healing professions is likely more multifaceted, with both desire for self-understanding and cure mixed in with the true desires to help and make a difference in others' lives. So this is to say that although there are these reasons of wanting to self-heal that may draw people into the profession, it's really important to consider that the reason that anybody gets into a healing profession, or any profession for that matter, is often multifaceted, and that it is mixed with both maybe conscious and unconscious desires to heal the self, while also mixed in with a desire and a belief of wanting to help other people, wanting to understand other people. They can go together. Absolutely. Just some systemic reflections around the role of the wounded healer before we move on to conclusions. Um, the role of lived experience among practitioners is starting to be recognized a lot more by big organizations such as the BPS, which is the British Psychological Society. Previously, the role of lived experience was often ignored or sidelined or just simply not considered, whereas in the last 5 or 6 years, big organizations in the healing professions started to pay a bit more attention to what the role of lived experience within the practitioners is. However, despite this, many clinicians still report feeling unsafe to disclose their lived experiences through fear of stigmatization within the profession, being seen as incapable to perform their role, and simply not feeling supported in their workplace. So, despite more acknowledgement in recent years, what we're finding in the research is that people still don't really feel safe within their professions to be able to talk about their own lived experiences and how it may impact positively and negatively upon their professional status. And this is an interesting sort of contrast, being that working in a healing profession, one would assume that there would be a space provided, an acknowledgement of how mental health, how different types of suffering may affect anybody. However, often people in these professions report that it's their colleagues and upper management in particular who they often feel most uncomfortable sharing these types of feelings with. Further to this, clinicians tend to be poor attending to their own self needs. This has often been found within research that clinicians within the mental health space are often some of the poorest at actually engaging in their own self-care needs and will often put the care of other people before them. And this is, again, an interesting contrast between people who are working to encourage people to engage in self-care and to care for themselves. Yet, what the research indicates is that clinicians themselves tend to be some of the worst for actually engaging in their own self-care needs. So this is an interesting thing as well to think about, the sense of, okay, how does the system respond anyway to people disclosing lived experiences in this profession, but also how do individuals engage in their own self-care and acknowledge the needs that they might have. So there may be two things bashing into each other there. So perhaps a good way to tackle this is to normalize lived experience and I think this is particularly relevant, as we spoke about earlier, as lived experience within mental health professions seems to be the norm rather than the exception. So this seems even more important to normalize the role of lived experience within people coming to the profession and maintaining their professional conduct within the profession itself. Perhaps what we need to do is create a culture where self-care will more likely be promoted and the advantages of the wounded healer will be brought into focus while there's still the acknowledgement of the potential disadvantages of being a wounded healer. Okay, so in conclusion, the wounded healer is an image that is present across times and cultures with much representation with myths and stories. The key aspect of the wounded healer is an individual who has experienced some sort of wound. This wound is somewhat healed, and this healing experience is then used to inform and help in the healing of others. Being a wounded healer presents both advantages and disadvantages to both clients and therapists, and it's important that when we engage in literature and understanding around this, that both of those aspects are considered. A major motivator for people who are wounded to become healers is to self-heal, Systems would benefit from greater awareness of the reality of wounded healers in the workforce and a normalization of self-care and self-disclosure. Okay, so a reflective question to take away from today's episode is, what's the benefits and drawbacks of being a wounded healer versus being a non-wounded healer? Are there any aspects of being a wounded healer that might enhance somebody's ability over a healer? Or are there any non-wounded healing aspects that might benefit over somebody who identifies as a wounded healer? So we didn't necessarily contrast wounded healers versus non-wounded healers. However, a reflective thing to take away and think about after this podcast is what's the benefits and drawbacks of both of those things compared to each other. Thank you for listening. Speak to you again. Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're interested in supporting the show, please do visit the Patreon link in the show description. There's various different packages involved in the Patreon page, right from just supporting the show to further access to additional resources and access to workshops. You can also visit us on the website hereforyoucounselling.com. That's hereforyoucounselling.com. Again, a link within the show description. If you'd like to book onto additional workshops, there's also a link to the Eventbrite page in the show description. There's a variety of in-depth discussions around lots of the topics that we talk about in the show today. Thank you for listening. Hope you've enjoyed the show.